Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Turtlecast. We have another very special guest on today, Jeffrey L. Bowman. He is the co-founder and CEO of Reframe, and I don't know if you do Reframe.io, the whole thing, but
Yeah.
before you jump into the story of Reframe, one of the major things that stuck out to me, Jeffrey, is that we do not want to reimagine things; we want to reframe them. So before we even get into what you guys are doing, how you look at the data, what you offer, and how that kind of dovetails into the rest of the history here, I want to understand from a philosophical sense what you mean when you say reimagining is not the solution, reframing is.
Yeah, no, a great question to kick off the session. I want to thank you guys for having me on and really appreciate the work that you guys are doing yourself. So
Thank you.
when when we were thinking about the name of the at the time the service that we were providing, I had about 5 years of actually testing and learning our way into this practice, and that was while I was at Ogilvy. And when we would go into the room with CMOs at Ogilvy, um, a lot of the makeup of the room, um, were people that had great intent and great purpose, but there was really no change in the people that were actually in the room. Physical
Mm,
change, number one. And we would always have this conversation about, what does the end state look like? And they would use the word like reimagine, marketing, reimagine like digital it did for traditional marcom. And I went into a dictionary and I started looking at words. And when you're doing the naming of a company, it's really important because you want people to articulate what the outcome without them actually knowing it. And
right.
so, it wasn't about the same people leading, reimagining their aspirations. It was about them actually themselves reframing the idea of, what does change look like? And so when you think about reframe, you have to have inclusive with the origin of the people that are reimagining, meaning you need to actually have different people in the room. And so that's how we got to reframing, meaning it's almost like whenever you create a brand, if you can convince your consumers to say you, me, or I, that's half the battle because then it's making it very personal. And so
It's
that's why
associative at the point.
an
Big
association with it. So
adoption. Yeah.
exactly. And that's why we chose the word reframe because it's not just, you know, changing the picture, it's changing the actual structure of
That holds it
the
together.
outcome that holds us together.
Do you know, I wonder what Picasso would have to say about that, changing the outside of things. Your canvas is all well and good, but we got to change the wood in the back. We got to make it like titanium or something.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, that's what holds it up, right? Because
That's
if you put
correct.
that image just on the wall, hmm, it's you have to reframe it, make it
I think
stronger structurally.
that's a fantastic statement. Like, we got a pyramid here on this desk. If you consider, like, Giza over in Egypt, I don't know if you've ever been there, but you can't just throw all that stone on sand.
Mm-mm.
Sand tends to shift around,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that essentially weakens the entire structure. You wouldn't be able to have it. So that focus point up at the top, I like where this metaphor is going. The focus point up at the top, you can't achieve it. You know where it is in your mind, but actually getting there won't happen because the foundation that would support something like that hasn't actually been reframed properly.
Right, right. And this is the first time in human history that what was once considered minority becomes the majority. And it's not just race or ethnicity. It's also you think about the Middle East, religion. You
Hmm.
think about gender in terms of women. I think you just had a pretty significant incident that happened in Afghanistan where you had women actually going to school. So you think about that being reframed in terms of what does that region look like once more women are educated. You think about youth, where more than 50% of populations that had once been dominated by 40 plus are now dominated, 29 below in terms of age. So it's a significant shift that's happening across the world. For the first time, what was ever referenced as minority will now become the majority population. And it's almost like, the ice age, right? When humans evolved,
Tell
and
me about it.
became the dominant creatures. And so when you
Yeah.
look at it today, we're kind of going through that, where you think about global warming, you think about all the things from a macro standpoint now have to be reframed or thought about for a whole group of people that have never once been the majority in this inhabited earth. So, yeah.
I think listen, Jeffrey, that's a phenomenal point, considering the fact that what we may do here in the United States has a large impact on the perspective and mindset and also physical aspects of the locale of other people that may be in Indonesia,
Right,
that may be in some one-off island up in Russia, up on the coast, right? Or
right.
be in any of the sub-Saharan African countries.
Yeah,
It's so inherently interlinked now.
yeah,
The adoption of decentralization also requires self-responsibility. And then when all these people become self-responsible and sovereign over themselves, they need to realize that, well, if I want to respect this for me, it's also going to require me respecting it for others.
yeah,
So the reframing of how I begin to appreciate others in their diversity is going to be important because of how diverse the growth and the amount of energy in a younger generation that is less static can
yeah,
actually adopt that.
yeah.
And then when I think in a corporate sense, if you're a resource holder, you need to adapt to what this data is showing you, the interlinked processes, that sort of inclusion. Go ahead.
Right. No, I mean, you're spot on. I mean, look, what we do, um, oftentimes, if we go to a senior leader and they hear about us, they'll think, you know, DE&I if it's changed within the workplace, or they'll think multicultural marketing if it's changed from a marketplace perspective, right? And I'm
Right.
like, no, 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 no. Why? Nothing's wrong with those quote unquote practices, but you know, I like to sometimes give my story. I'm, 2 to 3 generations removed from the civil rights era. Let's say I was born in 1970. And so when you think about that, for people, when they immediately go to that, they are, you know, omitting or admitting that, they think more in terms of integration versus true inclusivity. Because when you think about
What's
those,
what's the difference here? Let's clarify that for people.
uh, no, I think when you think about DEI and multicultural marketing, these are practices that were essentially um, developed as America was going from segregated to integrated, right?
Right.
And so you take, the 1960s, the late 1960s, a lot of tension. You had a war globally. You had, significant deaths. You had the height of the civil rights movement. And a lot of that tension was at a point similar to what we're going through right now, because there was a changing demographic, educationally, politically, both US and globally. But still, center of power was the US. And so when blacks, specifically US, started growing, laws shifted, started getting education, was once dominated by one population in thought as well, now had to make space and places for blacks. Still 1970s. And so those practices were originally developed corporate wise so that you now could integrate people into the workplace as well as integrate the marketplace in terms of how brands at that particular time were to market and profit from these upwardly now mobile, more educated blacks in America. And so,
So
flash forward,
yeah.
that's integration, right? Flash forward, now their children and their children's children have become educated. They've moved out of the South. They've gone globally, and one would argue have gotten to levels of SVP, VP, and what I think it was less than five black CEOs
Mhm.
in the nation in terms of Fortune 500. So now you shift from now embedding, going from integration and embedding their thoughts, their plans, their aspirations in terms of culture, workplace culture, so that not only do you bring them into the company, but you retain them. You retain that intellectual property that they can provide as it relates to value for your company. And that wasn't the
Yeah,
case in 1970.
Jeffrey, you talk about in your book Reframe, and I encourage everyone to get it. They can get it on Amazon. About corporate America, because I kind of want to get a little micro here, and then the cultural crossroads, and you call it a perfect storm. What is the difference are you seeing now, especially with the pandemic,
Yeah,
that you saw in the late 1960s? Are we ready for this, do you think now? I know we weren't really ready for it then.
yeah,
The population as a whole.
yeah. No, it's a I'll take it. If one of the reasons we call it like the perfect storm is because before we could count impact based on race, identity, gender, right? So when you look at a lot of report outs that companies will provide as relates to DE&I, over the last 60 years, that's been the metric, right? And so that's an amazing metric, but you look at all the people that came into those companies and left, right? Didn't retain them, didn't reward them, and didn't promote them. But we had DE&I. And so when you think about, today, um, how do you build a more culturally inclusive organization? And we define culture based on social science. I'm going to even go more micro. When you think about culture within the workplace, we restated the problem, right? Because when you think about minorities becoming the majority, everything has to be reframed structurally, your strategy, your systems, your employee segments, and your solutions in terms of who you partner with. Because what was once the minority becomes a majority, you're not just doing integration, you actually have to build an entire new culture that reflects the people that are now going to be the dominant demographic population within your workplace. The reason it's a perfect storm is because part of the reason that the workplace couldn't move at the pace of the marketplace. You think Amazon, you think Dell, you think Facebook, these guys are massive because of what? Addressable data. And the way that you are able to get those addressable data is because you have a platform. And then you're able to shift attitudes and behaviors in a very dynamic way because there are multiple points of that variables that you have on that consumer. In the workplace, it wasn't digitalized. Pre-COVID, only 2% of Fortune 1000 companies were digital from onboarding to exit.
Mm.
Now that you have employee experience platforms, which we built, you're able to get that addressable data, understand where people are, provide them with the personalization in terms of content, solutions, and shift those attitudes and behaviors very similar to the way that consumer or B2C companies can shift attitudes and behaviors as it relates to consumers. And so when you
Okay.
think about where do we go with that, um, much longer runway on the workplace side than the marketplace side. Does that
All
make
right.
sense?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a
yeah.
lot to unpack. You know?
I am reframing some thoughts right now in my head. If I look at the word integration and you like looking at the dictionary, it's almost like I have an opposite and I want to just bring it in. I want it to become a part of whatever the quantitative metric is. And we looked at that quantitative metric for some times. Companies are saying, oh, we're doing great. But those people don't want to stay.
Right.
Because in a legitimate sense, the culture does not align. It's much akin to the fact of most hospitals set their own quantitative benchmarks. Oh, we're doing fantastic. But little do you know is that half the people that left said, I'm never going back in there. I don't ever want surgery there again. But they're like, look how many people we got out of the beds, look how efficient this is. But it doesn't breed a culture of come back, stay,
Right.
trust, all
Right.
those other
Bedside
things.
manner.
Yeah, bedside manner, all that stuff. So the way I am understanding this then is that you need to leave the aspects of integration because it only looks at a human being in the sense of a number and a number for the benefit of the corporation. And what you're saying is let's look at the qualitative measures through a social science first. Let's understand the human being as a human being. And let's refine the culture we have here at our corporation to align with human beings, not look at them as hitting a metric to make us be at whatever benchmark, we perceive that it needs to be at to look good to other third parties, but truly have something that encapsulates the value of what it means to be a human being, living, breathing, and thinking, and then be able to retain that intellectual property as an employee of that corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
then that takes that next obvious bridge where Reframe comes in. They're like, okay, I'm glad you've hit all these marks, but let's talk about what is missed. We started with the qualitative aspects of how we should look and value other human beings, and then we applied a quantitative measure to it. Rather than saying, let's go with the idea of quantitative measurements first, look at people like cattle in a labor force, make sure that we have the right amount of Angus beef as opposed to just, regular old, dairy cows. And then if we have that ratio right, then we're good sailing. But what you're saying is that the amount of value of diversity, equity, inclusion, and other aspects of corporate America, when they shift over to the qualitative and then measure it with a quantitative stance, knowing how you want the culture to be first at a human level, has a much more dramatic impact. One that is, I guess, stronger in the sense of how society is shifting and changing and can actually work with the dynamicism of what we're seeing today. Is that how I understand how things work from the reframe sense?
Yeah. Yes, but I'll add a little bit more context. You know.
Please, yeah.
So sometimes we like to say we're like the McKinsey of culture. What we
Okay.
do, right? Um, when you the outcome of what we have is cultural transformation, right? That's the first thing we do. Why is that important? Before you even get into building more inclusive employee experiences. So, what we do, we're the McKinsey of culture. We help people leaders, CEOs, CMOs, and chief human resource officers build more inclusive customer and employee experiences, right? And the reason we like to state that is because, you know, if you look at most companies, with the exception of the last 30 years, they came out of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and some 70s, right? Dynamic ones. And so, for most companies, they either reflect their founder, the values, the mission, ambition, or reflect a set of people that came up with those values, missions, etc. Right? Now, there's no problem with that, but most of the people that were in those rooms didn't look like me and the generation that's ahead of us. Right? So
Yeah.
that's amazing. So
Yeah.
that's number one. So
That's true.
whose culture did you design for?
Mm.
Right?
You designed it
The,
only for that one individual. It's like, well, if this is how the
or
CEO operates, what he values, that's his culture.
or that generation that
Right.
were the founders of those companies. And even with tech companies today, if you look at Silicon Valley, you look at who's being funded, it's still one dominant culture, right?
Mm.
I think I read something where Stanford, Harvard, Penn, maybe three or four other institutions accounted for like 70% of people that make funding decisions, right? So whose culture, even if you went to those institutions, whose culture are you still designing for?
Right.
Right? So that's why we took it to culture, not demographics, right? Because there could be black and brown people that went to those institutions that are in that club, but they still think, act, and do a certain way, which
Right.
creates barriers to letting other people come into those ecosystems, right? So
Mm.
that's what we call a monocultural piece of thinking.
We've
And
seen how
so
bad monocropping is for the environment, so monocultural thinking is probably just as terrible.
just as terrible, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a human impact to it, right?
Right.
And it's a social economic impact as well when you think of globalization, right? So that's number one. Number two, the reason we wanted to do social science versus like, race and identity is because you need both, okay? Not just one or the other. You need to see that you are diversifying your organization as an entry point. You get no rewards for doing that, right? Because true change happens when there's a cultural shift. So now that you've got a diverse and organization, how do you make it inclusive culturally? And so we came out with an assessment tool because if you think about change management, you have to have what we call a maturity model. And so when
Mhm.
CEOs want to do digital transformation, you have to have a maturity model to see here's where I'm at, here's where I need to get to. Same thing with quality, Six Sigma. If you're into quality, automotive, the 70s and 80s, the US is getting their asses kicked with regards to Nissan, then eventually Toyota came, TQM.
Gotta go to Toyota. How you guys doing? I remember the famous story. They said, "Why aren't you hammering the door?" Like, because they went over to view the factories over in Japan. They're like, "Why don't
Yeah,
you hammer the door to put it in place?" And they said, "Well, we designed it to fit right the first time."
yeah, yeah. And Six Sigma was a lot of that. So it was a maturity model. What was missing was okay, how do you take it beyond diversity? How do you create true cultural inclusion?
Yeah.
And the third piece, how do you measure it? Right? Using similar systems that every organization uses for transformation. And so we came up with not came up, we developed an instrument that measures how culturally mature an organization is, right? So that's number one. Two things missing: restate the problem. You can't, what's the definition of crazy, right? Doing the same
Yep.
thing,
Classic
expecting,
Einstein quote.
right?
Yep. Here we go.
That's
Yeah.
number one, right? So let's restate it. Okay. Okay, we can't say the same thing and then use the same application. We're gonna get it
I
right
keep
this
telling
time.
Jason that. He says, I'm like, restate the damn thing.
Restate it. So we did a study and found out that corporate America, or it's 2 to 3 generations culturally removed from the new America, right? Culture is
Yes.
mono, multi, cross, poly, and trans. Those are the 5 stages as it relates to culture from social science, right? So if everybody's
Carl Jung's
monocultural,
drooling right now
uh,
over you. He's in his grave, Carl Jung. He's just like, I'm so fuzzy and warm listening to Jeffrey talk.
so these are things that have been done since the 1930s, right? Social
Right.
science, but nobody was applying it to this problem because it hadn't been restated, right?
Mm.
So that was number two. Number three, okay, how do you take a sample size of the organization? So we go in and we do one-on-one interviews and we assess the company structure, the strategy, segments, systems, and solutions.
Right.
Once we come back with that sample size, that's the qualitative aspect of it, right? But we score them. And when we were designing these or doing the assessments and designing the experience, we would hand over to the chief human resource officer, IT, whomever, but they didn't have the software.
Yeah. How do I implement?
They had single use applications. So they had Slack for messaging. They maybe had an ERP, but it took them 5 years to do. Or they had Microsoft, which at the time was productivity software. and then they had maybe a talent acquisition piece. But all those people were in separate functional areas and they never really talked to each other. But you as a user, as an employee, you just saw multiple logins. And so
Yeah.
we built a software to scale and sustain that change that we designed from a service side of our business.
So
And that
the
gets to the
guys over at
quant piece that you talked about,
yeah,
right?
thank you. Yeah, that was thank you for bringing that about in a roundabout process. I really do appreciate that. The guys over at Slack in Silicon Valley are probably just like this Jeffrey,
Yeah,
this, you
that
know.
and
I want to get
Microsoft.
into Jeffrey, if you don't mind. I want to get into, because you talk about in your book, you talk about brands,
Yeah.
and I want to get specific, like Nike, Patagonia, Trader Joe's, Lululemon. How are these brands getting it right in this area?
So I think that there's a couple things to unpack. There's an inclusive customer experience and there's an inclusive employee experience, right? And when you think about Nike, um, they had over the years, one could argue that, they played to the athlete.
Mm.
And they played to the experience before it was a thing. And when you think about Nike as a brand outside, um, people were able to champion and rally around the promise, just do it, right? Aspiration. And they did it over and over and over again through what we deem today as influencers. Okay. Now, what just recently happened at Nike, right? You had somewhat of an issue in terms of inclusivity, in terms of
Mhm.
women in high roles and positions, and black and brown. So again, these things were great up to a certain point, but now you have more women in the workplace. Now you have more women in sports. Now you have other dynamics as it relates to disabled, more diverse pool of people that they now have to source from. And so I think Nike has had a long roadway. The questions will become, can they do it for another, 40 to 50 years, doing the way that they've done it for the last, 40 to 50 years. So that's what I'd say to like Nike and the rest of the brands. I think the best job that they've been able to do, at least outside in, is create and build those experiences that are culturally inclusive. Because when you think about Nike, you think about some of the brands that are really doing a good job today. I think that, more than anything, they've been able to build those brands by being inclusive from a cultural standpoint, which is a lot different than, what some would argue diverse or diversity as a whole.
S- If so I'm considering this for a second. You said the brand has grown because of the culture of the company itself. Is the company the driver here, or is it the people that interact with the company the driver? I take the stance personally, and we do here,
Yeah,
that we are not the champions in this.
agreed.
Yeah, we may have a good culture. Yeah, we may
Yeah,
doing this, but at the end of the day, we're the Sherpa for the rest of the world. The
should
world,
be.
every individual is their own champion. And we understand that if it wasn't for their interaction with us,
Yeah.
that we would cease to exist. And I feel like that is missed so much. So when I hear that the culture of the actual company itself has grown the brand, that seems extremely centralized in the aspect of what is going on in a very decentralized format. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Nike, if you think about, since we're using, I think Nike is at a pivotal point,
Okay.
right? And what we like to say is how do we future proof your brand,
Mhm.
Mm.
right? So you take Nike, for instance, at one point it was heavily retail driven in terms of distribution. It was heavily centric in terms of television, the use of traditional athletes, right? Football, basketball, the $1 billion sports um, activities at that particular time. So that's, let's say, Nike pre 2000, right? Now, over the last 20 years, what has Nike done? It's created ways that are much more decentralized. Number one,
Yep.
they created an app that can now you can reframe. You're the athlete now. You being you, not something that was extremely. You can't jump like Michael Jordan, right? But if you run, you can create a community of other people that are like you. The other thing I think they were really good at doing, they went beyond your traditional sports. They got into partnerships with women athletes, with musicians. Although that went a little bad in terms of the influence piece. And I think they really got closer to that end user, whereas before, I don't think they have been as close or that close. And heavily personalization in terms of you being able to design the shoe for you. So I think to your
Yep.
point, it became very decentralized. But I also think that they're just scratching the surface when it comes
Right.
to what does that future look like.
No, I think that's interesting. And Jason brought up Patagonia.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
That's an
in,
environmental aspect that they're very strong in.
they're
Yeah.
very strong in.
yeah,
If you think about it, the clothing was a tool.
right,
That's all it was. The clothing was all but a tool
yeah,
and a billboard for people to say, "This is what we stand for."
yeah,
It's not really about the Nikes. It's
right,
not about the micro puff jacket, right?
yeah,
It's about what the human being sees in the future. And go ahead.
yeah. No, I want to, you know, um, use. I have an advertising background as well as brand, and oftentimes we would talk about the HX, the human experience.
Mhm.
I think those are wonderful words as long as we have all different types of humans. Um,
Mm. I love this.
um,
I love where he's
I
going.
love the way he's headed with this. This is great.
in
I'm
the
teeing you up right now with
conversation,
a Nike golf ball, and you got
yeah,
your Nike golf stuff on. You're good to
yeah.
go. Keep going.
No, and I think that's why when we think about you know um, the idea of future proofing your business or your brand is that we can use those words, but at the same time, that's where the diversity piece comes in, right? Like
Mhm.
you have to have representation at the table or in the room or in the club or in the community to get to that outcome that's reflective of humans, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's the only thing I've seen where we'll be presenting a piece of creative and we're talking about the human experience. And then we ask them, well, what was your end sample size? And you look at the research that they did, and it's not all the different types of humans that are inclusive of that.
Well, they
And
should have went to
so,
Tartle.
Well, I think a prime example is Rihanna here recently, where she did a genderless with reveal with her makeup, and then the
yeah,
fashion show. Everything was genderless. I mean, and the talk. I mean, that was just all over Twitter and everything else.
yeah,
Right.
I
yeah,
think that's a perfect example of what you're talking about, and
yeah,
it's sad. It's sad when because you can see it. When you go, even just if you're looking at clothes or micro jackets, and just look at the models. It's like
yeah,
where is the diversification? Where is it there? Where's an American that's Iranian? Where's
Yeah.
yeah,
that at? You know what I mean?
right,
No, and
right,
we've talked about this too. You'll diversify your risks financially, but you won't diversify people within your own
yeah,
culture. Like,
yeah,
come on. If you're
yeah,
thinking about risk, I mean, talk about an unseen one. It's the human beings, right? And you can't
right.
even make a decision to diversify risk if you don't have a human being right there actually doing that decision.
Yeah, I mean, you look at some of the biggest tech companies, right? Fame. You look at every one of them.
Yep.
And for some reason, they can go out and solve, building communities in the world, but they can't build an inclusive community within their four walls.
Right.
So, I think part of the issue there is that they're not being innovative in terms of how they approach building the future of their workforce. And that's, we'll use old models like, well, let's start a tech campus in an HBCU. And I'm like, well, for those, you think about, uh, I think it was Google that started an HBCU campus at Google at the time. And I'm like, wait a
Hmm.
minute, why don't you just get off your lazy asses and go recruit at those campuses
Correct.
and bring them in? Like, you don't have to set up this infrastructure. Like, no, like that should be a part of your job, right? And, I just, it fathers me that sometimes you have all of these resources, but you sometimes lean back on your biases and your belief system that's not consistent with where the world is going.
It's the Procrustean bed. I mean, you're talking about a group of engineers, right? Their
Hmm.
foundation was on engineering. They think that they can engineer people. That's the thing. They're trying to, here's the size of the bed. Let's cut their legs off to get them to fit the bed rather
Yeah,
than why don't we just fit the bed
yeah,
to the people? Right. And they're forcing stuff into these buckets. I mean, and that's where you've seen the issues with the marketing and like the sense of control because that that human element is completely mixed. The way they operate is in this very engineering focused operation, all for the technology, all for this, all for the cherry picking. But it was like, well, what about for the human being?
great,
I'm glad you guys have evolved so quickly and you've helped other people adopt this technology, but you've lacked your own evolution internally. And so if you
exactly.
don't have that balance, you have a huge weakness. And it doesn't matter how large you are.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see some of that play out. If you think about the way that tech has evolved and like let's for all purposes, Gen 1, let's say 80s and 90s, Gen 2, 90s, 2000s, Gen 3, 2000 to the current state. Um, it's almost like, fintech. When, you know, people started getting data specifically to consumers, it was done through credit cards, right?
Right.
Well, there was a whole swath of communities that didn't trust the internet. I don't know if I'm dating myself, but they didn't.
No,
If
there's a
you
lot of people that
swipe,
don't trust the internet still.
if you
Yeah.
swipe, they're gonna get all your information. And so for
Hmm.
a long time, black and brown and um, underserved communities didn't use their credit cards, right? So imagine all that data that wasn't deposited, that really didn't understand the attitudes and behaviors, and then you went to a different generation from a tech perspective. So a lot of those decisions from a science standpoint was based on only the people that had, swiped their card. Then obviously that caught
Thank
up,
you. You
right?
yeah, keep going.
Right?
You're doing great. Why don't you just come over here and work with us? You're doing great.
No,
You're
it's
doing
like,
great.
so those decision sciences that were being modeled at the time, right?
Mhm.
Now you have, higher speeds to where you went from like punch cards to actually, modeling, and then obviously cloud came. Well, you still had those trails of pixie digital footprints that were not inclusive, right? So then social media comes out, right? Guess what happens? Shifts the entire landscape of tech. Why? Because the creators, and what is the creator? Being under resourced and creating something that's of value for the masses.
Yep.
And who are those people that are the best creators in most cases? Black and brown people, because of the under resource that they have to now create. When social
Right.
media came, who got all the little blue thumbnails, right? The creators
That's right.
who didn't necessarily have the transactional. And now you build a transaction with the cultural piece, you got something really powerful in terms of what comes next. And so when you think about where we're going with tech to me, in terms of impact, is going to happen in those underestimated, as Arlene Hamilton liked to say, and globally, right? Because that's where the growth is.
Okay.
You know?
Jason, would you mind just sharing a story about why someone asked us why our focus isn't strictly on the US as a US tech company?
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, we're in 200 something countries, but it's funny when we talk with investors and they just want to focus on the United States so much. It's like, do you devalue these other countries? And I said, what if we had 1 billion users in everywhere but the United States? Oh, that would be great. Okay.
Yeah,
What's the
yeah,
difference between a user in Brazil compared to a user in Canada compared to a user in the United States?
right, right, right.
Well,
No, our engineers are in Brazil, by the way, and when you look at uncapped opportunities, um, it's really outside the U.S. You know,
Yes.
yep.
um,
Thank you. Yep.
and that's truly where the growth is. Like now that people have access to the tools, they're going to create their. If you think about everything U.S., it's primarily centralized. It's primarily race or identity based in terms of outcomes, in terms of the haves and the have-nots. Where if we go outside the U.S., in my opinion, and this is why we say from a cultural standpoint, D&I was not created for people outside the U.S. It was a
No.
Western practice that went Eastern just like corporations did, right? And so when you think about culture, social science, um, cross cultural as a practice developed in the 1930s, and it skipped the U.S. because the U.S. was still monocultural, and to this day it's still predominantly monocultural. And then went to Europe, and then went to other places and spaces because they were already diverse in terms of language, in terms of their makeup and their thinking. So that's why when you think about opportunities, it's really outside the U.S. that we believe we're going to be able to make an impact as much, if not more.
Yeah, I think that's super sharp, and honestly our data supports that. And we always want to share that when you describe somebody as a user of
Hmm.
technology, it sounds like someone that's doped up on heroin.
Hmm. Hmm.
When we are looking at this, and I had asked this question, I was like, why is it that you think the human being in the United States is worth more than the human being that might be in Chad or Niger?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then they're just stopped right there in their fucking tracks.
Hmm.
And then they're caught for a moment. They're like, yeah, you know what? It's like I did screw up in that thought process. My thought
Hmm.
was not reframed to where it should be.
Hmm.
My perspective of value is that people in the United States derive a higher dollar value
Hmm.
than an individual who might be in another country. That
Yeah.
does not work. That old model is not sustainable.
Nope.
And so when we expand upon this, I love the aspects of what you guys are doing at Reframe. I love that you look at the culture and then you say, okay, now that we have the culture in place, now we can really diversify for what needs to happen with our decision making.
Yeah.
You can look to more opportunities because you're not blind to them.
Right.
You don't have a biased perspective to say that the US is where it's at. No, listen, now that we have this truly inclusive culture and understanding culture of the value of a human being, we can
Yeah.
look to the rest of the world for that value. There's 330 million people in the US.
Right.
That leaves me with 7.2 billion people everywhere else. If
Yeah.
any person would look at that in any reasonable sense of the data, they'd be like, well, forget what's going on in the US. Let's go look at everything else that's happening here. Let's drive opportunity and understanding to those who understand what it means to be in an integrative culture, to come with different languages and backgrounds and have that sort of cross pollination that's happening.
Yeah. No. Look, I'll give you a real example of a company. We won at Ogilvy. Ogilvy was like our testing ground, right?
Yep.
We won a piece of business from Unilever. And Unilever, and this is all public information now, it's been some years. Unilever just acquired a company. I think it was Alberta Culver, and their brand from the acquisition was based on ethnic um, profiles, right? Um, you had perm hair. You had, if you walked into any drugstore, there was an ethnic section, and then there was all other.
I mean, Target still has one. I don't know why they still have that
Yeah,
all
yeah,
jacked up.
yeah. But here's the thing. We went in with our thesis as it relates to cross culturalism. Now, we were not the first to do this. I had someone that had a company called Hair Rules here in New York, and we approached the pitch not based on ethnic hair versus quote unquote general market hair. It was around texture based hair. So think about most hair profiles, you either got kinky, curly, wavy, or straight, no
Yep.
matter what race, ethnicity you are, right? So that's first, the human side, right?
Thank
And
you.
so when you do that, and when we did that, the question became, well, what happens to the other products? We have two sets of products, the acquisition, and then, all the other products that are made predominantly for white Eurocentric hair. And we said, well, what if you thought about your portfolio based on texture base versus ethnic base?
Mm-hmm.
So when we did that, it opened up the entire world in terms of product and profiles, right? And so when we won the business, it's a $3 million piece of business. We not only won the U.S., we won Africa, we won Asia in terms of certain parts of Asia, and it was really around this idea of what if we went to market in a texture-based outcome and
Love
profile
that.
versus ethnic base. Now, it also presented a issue for them because they had acquired all these other brands that were ethnic driven versus texture based. But if you
Well,
look at the
fix it.
hair, yeah, it just makes so much sense. And if you
Yeah.
look at the
It's not even
category
a
now,
problem. Go do it.
a lot of the category today is texture based. And
Mm.
obviously there's some nuances, but more importantly, if you think about more from a global perspective, you open up new categories and you open up new revenue streams that you never even thought about before.
No, you're correct. So I use a awfully expensive hair product called Pros. And I go in there and they ask me, first of all, what's the texture of your hair?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They didn't ask me if I was black, white,
Yeah.
yellow, Christian, Muslim. They didn't even give a shit.
Right.
They said,
Right.
what is the texture of your hair? This is how we're going to help make this solve happen.
Right.
You
Right.
know, and then I go through that sort of process, not asking me, what's my ethnic profile? How much money
Yeah.
do I make? That has nothing to do with me making my brand like truly valuable, one
Yeah.
that actually generates a real return. And when you have the human focus first, then it
Yeah.
generates a real return.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always go back to this and having just, you know, met and read about your company. That approach is great if you're just starting out, right? As a
Right.
product or brand. What sometimes gets people in trouble is if they've been in business for like 50 years and they want to jump to that, right? And
Yeah.
we call that going from a monocultural to cross cultural. Well, a lot of the data, a lot of things that you have from a research and insights perspective, either you have nothing or you have a little bit of something. And so, you have to go through that next evolution before you can just jump to the HS or the human experience.
Yeah.
Because what will happen is you haven't developed the cultural maturity to just jump to the human experience.
Yeah.
You still got to do the work, you know?
That's what I wanted to ask is, you have very mature firms, and I only use mature in the sense of their age, not in their
Hmm.
mindset.
Hmm.
Um, have you seen that it has been successful for people to go and adopt a new cultural reframing that is
Hmm.
happening here and the ability to maintain that?
Hmm.
Or, and on top of that, have you seen where firms try to just jump right into it all head first without the proper evolution steps, and then it fails.
Right. Look, I get that question. Get this question a lot. You know, we're just in the beginning phases, right?
Right.
We developed our thesis about 10 years ago. It didn't exist anywhere else, and I can say that with a high degree of confidence, right? McKinsey wrote the first white paper, 1966. And it's in the book, Reframe the Marketplace. McKinsey wrote this white paper that talked about the essentially the changing face of America. And if you think about 1966, that was really the impetus of both DE&I and multicultural marketing. So 1966. And the reason they wrote the white paper is because CEOs were kind of like at this crossroad, right? You had riots, you had MLK, you had Malcolm X, you had the Kennedys. Like it was, beyond imagination. And so they said, how do we solve this? So McKinsey wrote the white paper. It was about, being this total marketplace. Think about it holistically. And the CEOs are like, no. We got to be very focused. And they chose to focus on ethnic outcomes, right? Because you can measure it, you can see it, impact. And my sales going out within the Black community, and my attracting and retaining Blacks in terms of workforce, because Blacks at that time were the majority minority. Flash forward 2010, when we reintroduced the topic, people have to remember there was no change operating system, right?
Wow.
There was none. Everything had been done, either DE&I or multicultural marketing.
Right.
So we had to first develop the operating system. There was no change operating system for the type of outcomes that we provide as it relates to building inclusive employee and customer experiences. The second thing I'll say, there was no operating system. And then when those practices were developed, there was no tech, period. And so then, 2019, we started building the software to operationalize and scale what we design from an experience standpoint. And so when you ask the question, like, who's doing it, who's getting it right, I'd say very few.
Okay.
You take GM, for instance, right? I don't know if you guys know, but last year with George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, caused a global, sense of awareness in terms of equity and inclusion. GM comes out, hey, we're going to make the personal statement. That's amazing. And then you had other companies that came out and made pledges. All those are amazing things. But you don't do the work in terms of operationalizing change that reflects this new America, right? You don't.
I'm thinking of GM's board.
Yeah, I know.
Old white guys that smoke cigars.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, we have a client, Restaurants Associates, right? 80% of the employees are Black and brown. What we did with them over the last year and a half was help them culturally transform through the assessment, getting the scoring, working with the EXCO executive committee, doing the report out, then the experience design, right? Like every company has an experience from an employee standpoint that needs to be reframed, culturally inclusive, take the sample, redesign it, and then scale and sustain that. And if a company is not doing that, you're using an old approach to a new group of users, right?
Right.
And so that's what we mean in terms of doing that work. And it takes 2 to 3 years at a minimum, because you've been in business 50, 60, 70 years, all geared toward one group, a majority population.
Yeah, no, that's hard. I mean, like, I don't know if your parents are still alive. That's like going
Yes.
to a family dinner and then trying to change everybody's mindset,
Oh, it's tough. It's tough.
right? Am I
The,
off with that
no,
analogy here? I feel like that's what it is.
you're not a, look, you're spot on. Imagine the family types of conversations you have too, right?
Mm,
And the tension associated with that. So that's why we have to be evidence based. Some people say, well,
there you
Jeffrey,
go.
why is it that you just don't, to your point, we talked about investors, right? We've talked to a couple of VCs and they immediately want you to go to like software. I said, yeah, we're software as a service. We're software and service company. We say that intentionally because you're not going to solve this problem just software alone. The services sets up the software.
Yep.
And if not, great, we'll take your money, but you're not going to solve this problem strictly based on software because you're then assuming your customers or your clients know how to solve it and they're just using your software to enable it.
You
And
should have
that's
used the
not.
Reframe software on the VC. I got to tell you, your benchmark's
Absolutely.
real low on here. Yeah.
And,
Uh,
it's a hard, you guys have been out there. Sometimes it's just like,
yeah.
guys, herd mentality. Good luck with that, you know?
It's actually no, it's comical. Well, I got to tell you, I mean, we're creeping up on the hour here.
Yeah.
You've
It
done
went by
some
quick. Oh my goodness.
well, it's nice well because you get in the zone and every
Yeah.
time you tee me up and you say, "Look, you got my attention. I'm watching." You know what I mean? I'm like waiting for that good thought to roll out.
Yeah.
So, other than the fact that everybody should sign up and use your software, that's bar none.
And services.
Yeah, software and services. I'm sorry, it's that VC mindset creeping in. It's so Silicon Valley of me. Uh, what is it in terms of a message you would like to leave not only for the executives of these larger Fortune 500s or Fortune 1000s, but what is the message you want to leave for all of the people across the world that interact with these brands to know that what you are doing is trying to create that bridge from an internal aspect and an external aspect? Can you please share with us what you'd want to leave with them?
I think that for companies that truly, want to build a brand or a company for generations to come, every brand, every company needs to culturally transform. And, you know, when we think about the way that organizations are addressing change today, um, we need these companies to address change in the same way that they would address change going from analog to digital. It needs to be um, an approach that's, you know, structurally different and sustainable as it relates to that change that reflects this new America or new world. And that's really the message there. I continue to look at my industry that I came from, advertising and marketing. Every major media company today in 2020 is coming out with pronouncements that we're going to invest in Black media. Okay. Now, why is that an issue? Well, the marketing communications industry is about $700 billion global industry. And when companies decide to do things strictly based on race and identity, that means you designate a percentage of your spend to this
Mhm.
community. Well, I'm a Black owned business. I'm not only wanting to get the Black dollars, but I want to get all the dollars.
Right.
So, there in
Yeah.
itself is another
It's so
example
self-limiting.
of the wrong approach. I want to compete
Yeah.
for the entire $700 billion,
Want
not
the whole pie.
5% of the $700 billion. And so that's what I mean in terms of structural change that needs to happen for companies, and approaching it from a 1960s mindset.
Love that.
Does that
Listen,
make sense?
That makes abundantly clear sense to us over here. Okay.
Yeah.
So Jeffrey, thank you again so much for coming onto Turtle to share this. If any of your clients need a truly representative global statistical set of people to really understand what's going on, feel free to send them our way. We got
Will
the
do,
whole
sir.
globe over here.
Awesome.
But you championing this message is phenomenal. It's completely uphill.
Yeah.
For you to work with these corporations. I feel like you're going to every dinner table in America. But just remember, you have the rest of humanity behind you and all of us. So thank you again for all of your work.
Well, thank you guys for your time. All right.
Most definitely.